South Africa's response so far seems inadequate. He joins me now via Skype to discuss this further. Professor Gumede, very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Why would you say that the responses are quite inadequate?
It's quite inadequate because if one compare what other countries are doing, it's not only the developed countries, but also industrial countries. Normally, we've seen the average is normally between 1% of GDP to about 11%, which is the upper end, the Singapores of this world, and in the US, 11%. Then we have a middle range, Brazil. I mean, they've spent about 5% of GDP. And then we're talking, India spent 1% of GDP. So I'll compare you what 1% of GDP means, for example, in the Indian context. I mean, they've spent, something like over 200 billion rand on dealing with the coronavirus in their country. So that is the kind of figures that we have to look at if we want to do two things. If we want to also recover from the coronavirus, because the coronavirus, yes, it's a health issue, but it's also an economic crisis. So we have to spend to get out of that economic crisis.
And the economic effects are quite severe. I mean, projections are now suggesting that the economic disruption to the economy is costing about 13 billion rand per day to the local economy, and about 370,000 jobs, it is projected, are on the line for the year 2020 alone. So heaven knows what will happen next year. So I suppose then it is prudent that we start focusing on the post-lockdown analysis of how the country will get up and rise back to its feet.
Now, absolutely. Therefore, so any stimulus package must do two things. First thing, it must try to protect jobs. And then secondly, what it needs to do is, those who don't have jobs, who are vulnerable and poor, it must try to help them over the periods. Those who don't have food, children, the vulnerable, needs to be protected. They need to get food. They need to be carried over. That's the first part of a package, an ideal package. The second part of the ideal package is, how do we protect jobs? Firstly, we have to protect the vulnerable businesses. Now, unfortunately, South Africa is a country, a typical developing country, where most of our jobs sits in the informal sector. So 80% of people are taxi drivers, or they sell things on the street. So informal jobs, or they're self-employed. So it means we need to be a little bit more creative, because in the industrial countries, 80% of people are in the formal jobs. So we need to save the formal jobs, but also save the informal jobs. So that's where our imagination needs to be.
So can South Africa afford to spend more than it is already spending in its anti-COVID-19 drive? I mean, you talk of some countries funding their stimulus packages through debt and setting aside the existing monetary and as well as fiscal restrictions on the economy. Will this not come back to bite us in the long term?
We first have to, we rather have to start to say, we need to save lives, and then we need to save the economy. So lives first, then the economy. So, there is a lot of space. So the first part of the space is to say, the PIC, if we can take some money from the PIC. I mean, there's a lot of money that the PIC have been spending on really very unserious projects and so on. So, that's the first part. Then we can use money out of this. Now, the PIC, the Public Investment Company, yes, it is public pensions money, but we could use, some of the money. It sits with a trillion. If we can take at least 100 to 150 billion rand from there. Secondly, there's the unemployment, there's the IUF, the Unemployment Insurance Fund, where we can, those whose jobs are vulnerable, that we can give them something out of that. Then thirdly, there is money that sits, for example, with the Industrial Development Corporation, with a DPSA, the Development Bank of South Africa, those sort of money we can pool. Then also South Africa has a savings, a reserve savings, about 5 billion rand. We can also use that. Then, of course, it's a private sector, because we cannot get the economy going with the state alone. There has to be a partnership. So we have to work together. For example, what would a private sector partnership look like? It would look like we can go to the banks and say, let's use some of the money that the banks have in reserve, and use it to stimulate the economy, allow that money to be borrowed on very easy terms. So, there are a lot of room and already money available. We don't have to go abroad to the IMF and so on. Yet we have it. We just have to be imaginative and creative of using our existing resources.
Professor Gumede, the calls that economic activities must be allowed, but in a way that is consistent with, ensuring that the spread of COVID-19 remains controlled are now getting louder. So I suppose then that it suggests the reopening of such critical sectors as the manufacturing sector, as the informal sector, as basically the non-essential sector, as has been said in the past. So will this not come back to affect us in a way, because we'll now go back to the increased infection rates and in the long term the government spending more on fighting coronavirus?
Absolutely. So the challenge, if we go back too early, really, then it can boomerang. Then we will actually spend more money in, when the wave, a new wave of epidemic. So I think, the president has been, prudent. He has been advised by medical experts to say, let's wait for 2 weeks. Let's give another 2 weeks to try containment. Let's test enough people, and then only then, look at bringing sectors of the economy, slowly back into, operating.
So how does the South African economy get back on its feet?
I mean, it has to, by emergency package. That's the first thing. So we've got over the next few days, I think there has to be more creativity of actually spending on people who, who don't have anything, on the unemployed and the self-employed. We have to find the money creatively to do that. Then secondly, what we have to do, rescue the businesses, that are key to the economy. They're really key business to the economy. If they struggle, let's support them. If we do that, that will really help the economy to get back, when lockdown is lifted.
And what about the informal economy, which has been largely overlooked? I mean, the fact that the government has come up with measures of cushioning businesses against coronavirus in the form of tax breaks, in the form of cash payments. Nothing is being said about the informal economy, yet they form a huge part of the national economy at large.
Absolutely, and then that is the weakness of our emergency structure. One of the big weaknesses. I mean, one way to deal with the informal economy, really, it is to give people access to grants over this period and so on. To do that, and I think it's an oversight that we haven't done it. I mean, in India, for example, they've done it. What they've done is, they've given people in the informal sector grants over their lockdown periods, not loans, but grants and so on. So that is going to be really important that we have to do that. Otherwise, we're going to have two crises. Firstly, people will revolt because they have no money. They've got nothing to eat, and the business, informal businesses are collapsing. We may have, a social explosion when we lift the lockdown because people will be so angry. So we really have to, to intervene there by giving some grants, whether it's grants from the private sector or grants from the state.
Professor William Gumede, thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. That was Professor William Gumede from the School of Governance at Wits University. This is The Globe. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be right back.